The morning Stephen Chambers walked up the gravel drive to Ashford Grange. She carried nothing with her but the knowledge that she had already lost, and the intention of making Lady Vane say so aloud in front of witnesses. The drive was long. The November frost of the previous autumn had heaved the gravel into shallow ridges, and no one had raked it since, which told her something about how the estate was being managed in the absence of its lord. The iron gate at the foot of the hill stood open on one hinge, the latch rusted through. She walked past it without pausing. The great house rose at the top of the slope, grey stone, 6 windows across the facade, a row of chimneys producing the thin, economical smoke of rooms being minimally warmed rather than lived in. She had looked at those chimneys all her life from the cottage below, and never needed to count them before. She counted them now. She was 23 years old, the daughter of a man who had farmed the Ashford tenancy for 16 years without significant complaint, and she had been managing it alone since October, when her father died with £42 in debt to the estate, and Lady Vane's letter of condolence already reading more like a balance sheet than a sympathy. This was the spring of 1819. The ploughing had been delayed by the late frost. The 11 families who worked the Western holdings were watching from a respectful distance to see what the daughter of Robert Chambers would do when the formal eviction notice arrived, as it had done on the morning table 3 days ago, with a buyer's name already written into the body of the letter. She was going to do the only thing left to her. She was going to walk up the hill and say the thing plainly, and let Lady Vane refuse her in her own drawing room, in front of whoever happened to be there. But the story of that walk did not begin in the spring. It began in winter, in the cottage below, on a night when the snow came sideways across the hillside, and a man arrived at her door who could not stand on his own. The autumn of 1818 had not been kind to the Chambers tenancy. Stephen had spent the months since her father's death settling what accounts she could, disputing what she could not, and writing to Lady Vane 3 times in a register of careful, formal respect that earned no reply more substantive than a printed notice of the outstanding £42, which had grown to include a late fee that her father would have contested, and she had not the legal ground to refuse. Mrs. Ridley, who had been housekeeper at Ashford Grange for as long as Stephen could remember, slipped a pot of preserved pears onto the Chambers' doorstep in November, with a folded note that said, "Only hold on." Stephen set the pears on the kitchen shelf and found them oddly steadying. The snow began the 2nd week of December, earlier than anyone expected. It came fast and dense, and with the wind at an angle that made the cottage windows shudder in their frames, and by early evening the lane to the village was already impassable. Stephen had banked the fire, set a pot of broth to stay warm on the grate, and was reading by the only lamp worth burning when she heard the sound at the door, which was not a knock so much as a weight leaning against it, and then sliding. She opened it to find a man on her step who had been wounded in the side, or had injured himself in a fall, or both, because the 2 things produced the same result, which was a man who could not lift his own head, and whose coat was soaked through with blood and melted snow in equal parts. He wore no insignia that she could read in the dark. His boots were good quality, she noted automatically, the way a person notes such things when deciding in 2 seconds whether to call for help, that would take an hour to arrive in this weather or to act immediately. She acted immediately. She got him inside by degrees, one arm under his weight against the door frame, and then against the kitchen table, and then onto the settle near the fire. And she did this without asking his name because he was not in a condition to answer, and she was not in a condition to wait. She cut the coat away from the wound with the kitchen shears. The wound was a deep gash along the left side, consistent with a fall onto something sharp, or a blade, or both again, and it had not been dressed. She had dressed worse. Her father had put a scythe through his forearm in the summer of 1814, and she had sat with him through 3 days of fever before the village surgeon could be fetched, which meant she knew what a fever looked like when it was coming and what it needed before it arrived. She got clean linen. She got the broth off the grate. She got a second blanket from the upstairs room and draped it over him while he shivered with a violence that meant the cold had gone deep and the fever had not yet begun to burn it out. She did all of this by the light of the single lamp and the fire, and at no point did she stop to wonder whether she should. The fever came in the night and broke on the 3rd day and came back less severely on the 5th. He was delirious through the worst of it, speaking in fragments that she could not always pass, though she noted the precision of his speech, even in fever, the way certain words arrived whole and measured, even when the sentences around them dissolved. She pressed cold cloths to his forehead. She lifted him to drink broth when he was capable of it and let him sleep when he was not. She read aloud from the book on the side table when the nights were long, because her father had told her once that the sound of a voice reading steadied a person who was lost in fever, and she had no reason to disbelieve it. He became coherent on the 7th day. He looked at her across the room with grey eyes that registered something she could not quite name, a focused attention that seemed inconsistent with a man who had been insensible for the better part of a week, and said, in a level voice that carried no tremor, that he owed her an apology for the inconvenience. She told him it was no inconvenience because it was not, or rather, because she had decided it was not, which amounted to the same thing in practice. He told her his name was Edmund. He did not offer a surname. She did not ask for one because the middle of December was not a time for pressing a recovering man about his provenance, and because the cottage was warm and the snow was still falling and she had broth on the grate and a second lamp she had brought down from her own room, and the sum of those details made the question of surnames feel less urgent than it might have been in another kind of house. She told him her name was Stephen, which was unusual for a woman, and she had long since stopped feeling any need to explain it. Her father had expected a son. He had loved his daughter thoroughly in the absence of one, and the name had been part of that love, which made her fond of it. Edmund said it was a good name. He said it simply, without the small pause of social correction that most people inserted, and she found she liked him for that. The 6 weeks that followed had a quality she would not have found words for at the time, though she understood it more clearly later. The cottage had always been a working place, a place where the accounts were spread on the kitchen table, and the correspondence was answered by lamplight, and the day was organized around what needed doing and what could be left until the thaw. It remained a working place. She did not change its nature on his account. She continued to manage the tenancy correspondence such as it was, from the table while he convalesced on the settle with a book from her father's shelf. And, if the room felt different than it had before he arrived, she attributed it to the simple fact of another person being present, which was not the same as naming anything more particular. He was a careful reader. She noticed this because she was a careful reader herself, and recognized the signs, the way the pages were turned at intervals, that suggested actual thought rather than the performance of reading, the way he occasionally set the book face down on his knee for a minute before continuing. He read through the 3 volumes of agricultural management she had on the lower shelf without comment, and then asked whether she had anything on drainage, which she did. And the conversation that followed lasted through the afternoon in a way that surprised her by how little it surprised her. His hands, she noticed when he was well enough to sit at the table, were not a labourer's hands. The palms were not calloused in the pattern of field work. She noticed it the way she noticed the quality of his boots on the first night, as a piece of information she was not yet certain how to use. She did not press him. He did not volunteer. The snow continued at intervals through January, sealing the lane, excusing the silence on both sides. He helped when he was able. He was not the sort of man to sit still in another person's house when there was work to be done, and by the fourth week he was carrying wood and mending the latch on the cold pantry door, and sitting with the quarterly accounts at the table one evening when she came in from the yard to find him frowning at the column she had been frowning at herself for a fortnight. He looked up and said steadily that the drainage calculation on the East Holding was off by 6 shillings, which meant the projected yield had been calculated on a false base, and that the arrears might be arguable if she could demonstrate that the yield shortfall followed from an estate drainage deficiency rather than tenant negligence. She sat down across from him and looked at the column. He was right. The drainage deficiency was an estate responsibility, which meant the loss was not hers. She had known this in a general way. She had not had the arithmetic to prove it. She asked him how he knew estate accounting. He looked at the lamp for a moment, then back at the page, and said that he had studied it. She did not ask anything further. He did not offer anything further. The fire settled in the grate with a sound like a quiet verdict, and they both returned to the page. On the morning he left, the lane had cleared enough for a horse, and the parish road below was passable. He stood at the cottage door with his coat mended and his hat in his hand, and told her in the same measured way he said everything, that he would not forget what she had done. She told him she hoped his side gave him no more trouble. He held her gaze for a moment longer than the sentence required, then put on his hat and walked down the lane, and she watched him go until the hedge closed behind him, and then went inside and looked at the room, which was quiet again in the way rooms are quiet when they have recently been occupied. She did not know his surname. She did not know where he had come from or where he was going. She knew he read carefully, argued accurately from evidence, and had hands that had never worked a field, and that he had spent 6 weeks in her cottage without once making her feel that his presence was a debt she owed him. She thought about that, intermittently, through the rest of February and into March. She thought about it less than she might have, because Lady Vane's letters became more frequent in March and less ambiguous in their direction, and the 11 families on the Western Holdings began asking questions she could not yet answer, and the business of the tenancy required her attention more completely than any other consideration. The formal eviction notice arrived on a Tuesday in April, carried by a man from the estate office who left it on the table without meeting her eyes and walked back up the hill before she had finished reading it. The buyer named in the letter was a Mr. Hartley of York, whom she did not know. The sum offered for the tenancy transfer was £48, which was, she noted, £6 more than the outstanding arrears. The implication was not subtle. Lady Vane had found a buyer who would settle the debt and take possession, and the letter gave her 30 days. She put the letter down on the table and stood at the window for a while, looking up the hill at the Grange. The smoke from the chimneys was thin and economical, as it had been all winter. The gate at the foot of the drive still hung on one hinge. Someone, she thought, should fix that gate. She was still standing at the window when she heard Mrs. Ridley's step on the path, the particular quick step of a woman who has news and is not certain whether it will help, and she went to the door before the knock came. Mrs. Ridley was a compact woman in her late 50s, with a face that had been arranging itself around difficult information for decades, and had arrived at a settled composure that served equally well for condolence and warning. She came inside without being asked, because she had been coming inside this cottage since Stephen was in short frocks, and she sat at the table and set her hands flat on it, and said, without preamble, that Stephen should come to the Grange tomorrow morning, before Lady Vane met with the York solicitor at noon. Stephen asked why tomorrow morning specifically. Mrs. Ridley said with the particular careful neutrality of a woman who has spent 30 years not overstepping, that there was a matter of documents being arranged in the estate office, and that it would be better for Stephen to be present at the house than not. Stephen looked at her for a moment. Ridley looked back, level and composed, and there was something in her expression that was not quite hope and not quite urgency, but lived in the neighbourhood of both. Stephen said she would come. She went to the Grange the next morning. She did not go through the servants' entrance, which would have been the expected route for a tenant's daughter, because the occasion seemed to her to require that she arrive as what she was, which was a woman with a legitimate grievance, and the arithmetic to support it. She went up the gravel drive, past the gate on its one hinge, and rang at the front door. A footman she did not recognize admitted her to the entrance hall and went to announce her. The hall was cold, the floor was flagged stone, and the stone had not been swept recently, which was another thing that would not have happened under proper estate management. A portrait of the late Lord Ashford, Edmund's father, hung at the top of the stairs, a heavy-framed canvas that she had seen from the drive, but never from this angle. She looked at it for a moment while she waited. Lady Vane came out of the corridor to the right, which led toward the estate office and the small room that served the estate's accounting business. She was a tall woman of 50 or so, handsome in the way of people who have always assumed their handsomeness was owed to them, dressed in a dark morning gown with a lace collar that cost more than Stephen's quarterly accounts. She looked at Stephen with the particular expression of a person who finds a familiar inconvenience appearing at an inopportune moment. She said, in a voice intended to be heard by the footman still lingering near the passage door, that she supposed Miss Chambers had come about the notice. Stephen said she had. She said it without apology and without performance, in the level tone she used when she intended to be taken seriously. Lady Vane said the notice had been quite clear and the terms quite fair, and that 30 days was more than adequate time to make arrangements. She said it while turning back toward the corridor, in the manner of a person concluding a conversation that had not been formally begun. Stephen said to the back of her retreating gown that the drainage calculation on the East Holding had been understated in the estate's records, and that the yield shortfall that formed the basis of the arrears could be attributed to an estate deficiency rather than tenant failure, and that she had the arithmetic with her if Lady Vane wished to see it. That stopped her. Not because the argument was new, Stephen suspected, but because it was precise, and precision was a variety of resistance Lady Vane had not been expecting from this quarter. What stopped Stephen was not the pause, or the particular way Lady Vane's chin lifted before she turned. It was the sound of voices from behind the partially open door of the estate office, because the door was not fully latched, and voices carried differently through a gap than through solid wood. She heard Lady Vane's own voice, which was impossible since Lady Vane was standing 6 feet away from her, and then she understood it was not impossible at all, because what she was hearing was a conversation that was already in progress behind that door, not with Lady Vane, but with someone Lady Vane had been speaking with before Stephen arrived, and that someone was speaking back. She heard the name Chambers. She heard the word soldier. She heard in the voice of the other person the words traced and confirmed and estate solicitor. And then she heard Lady Vane's voice from the room saying, in the particular tone of someone placing a card face up, that the timing was unfortunate, but the authority was clear, and the identity of the wounded man, Stephen Chambers, had sheltered over the winter, had been confirmed by the estate solicitor as recently as Tuesday. Stephen stood very still in the entrance hall. The flagged floor was cold through her boots. The portrait of the late Lord Ashford looked down from the landing, with the patient expression of someone who has been waiting a long time for a particular conversation to end. She understood several things in the space of a few seconds. She understood that Edmund, whoever he was, had been identified. She understood that Lady Vane knew who he was. She understood that Lady Vane had known this since Tuesday, which was the same day the eviction notice had been delivered, and that the sequence of those two events was not a coincidence. She stood in the entrance hall and she did not go toward the door. She was not the sort of person who listened at doors, even half-open ones, and she had heard enough. She looked at the portrait for another moment, and then she looked at the corridor, and then the door to the estate office opened fully, and a man she had not seen before came out of it, carrying a leather document case with the unhurried precision of a man who has more papers than hours, and stopped when he saw her. He was thin, spectacled, dressed in a sober grey coat with ink on the second finger of his right hand. He looked at her with the neutral appraisal of a professional man who catalogues persons as he catalogues documents, noting what is relevant and setting aside what is not. He said, in a measured voice, that he believed he was looking at Miss Chambers. She said he was. He said his name was Phelps. He said he was Lord Ashford's secretary. He said without particular drama, because men of his type produce drama only by accident, and generally preferred to avoid it, that Lord Ashford had asked him to attend this meeting. Stephen heard the words Lord Ashford from across the entrance hall, and they landed the way a stone lands in still water. The immediate disturbance and then the radiating circles, because she understood in the same instant that the title belonged to Edmund and that Edmund had been Lord Ashford the entire time he lay on her settle, shivering through a fever, and that the hands that were not a labourer's hands and the reading habits and the estate accounting, and the 6 weeks of careful, level attention had belonged to the man who owned the cottage she was about to lose, and that he had known all of it and said nothing. She was still finding her footing in that understanding when Edmund himself appeared in the doorway of the estate office. He was dressed properly now, which meant entirely differently than the mended coat and the borrowed blanket, and the clothes suited him in the way that things suited a person who had always worn them, which answered the last of her questions about who he had been in the cottage without asking her to say so aloud. He looked at her across the entrance hall with the same grey eyes she had watched for 6 weeks, steady and unhurried, and he said quietly, "Her name. Not Miss Chambers. Her name." The way he had said it in the cottage, at the table, over the drainage column, over the accounts. She said, with considerable more composure than she felt, that she rather wished he had mentioned it earlier. He said he supposed he had. Lady Vane had appeared in the entrance hall by this point, drawn by the sound of Phelps's voice, and she stood now at the entrance to the corridor with a particular expression on her face, the expression of a woman who has arranged a room in a specific configuration and arrived to find the furniture rearranged. She looked at Phelps. She looked at Edmund. She looked at the document case under Phelps's arm with the attention of a person reading a situation they had believed they controlled. She said, in a voice that had lost its morning-room authority but was making an effort to recover it, that she did not understand the nature of the meeting. Edmund looked at her with a patience that was not unkind and not warm, the patience of a man returning to a house that had been managed in his absence by someone operating from a very particular set of assumptions. He said that the nature of the meeting was straightforward. He said that Phelps had the documents. He said very quietly that the Chambers tenancy was not in arrears. He said this in the tone of a man correcting an error in a column of figures, precisely, without accusation, in a way that was somehow more final than anger. The footman was still near the passage door. Mrs. Ridley had appeared at the top of the servants' stair that opened off the east side of the hall, drawn by the particular quality of silence that precedes important events in old houses. And she stood there with her hands folded and her face arranged in its settled composure, with something underneath it that was not quite a smile and not quite relief, but was moving steadily toward both. Phelps opened the document case with the efficiency of a man who has been preparing for exactly this moment, and set 2 documents on the hall table that served as the entrance's only furniture. He directed Lady Vane's attention to the first one, which was a letter bearing the Ashford estate seal, written in Edmund's hand, addressed to the estate solicitor in December of the previous year. Stephen noted the date. He had written it before the fever. He had written it sometime before the snow began, before the storm, before the night he arrived at her door, and she filed this piece of information carefully. He had written it in December, and its content, as Phelps summarized it in the quiet recitative of a man reading from a prepared brief, was a specific accounting of the drainage deficiency on the East Holding, a notation of the consequent yield shortfall across 6 seasons, and a formal direction to recalculate the Chamber's tenancy accounts accordingly, with the resulting balance to be set at a nil. Nil. Not £42, not 48 with the buyer's convenience fee. Nil, because the arithmetic had been wrong, and Edmund had known it was wrong, and he had written it down before the storm arrived, and he had not been able to deliver it because he had been lying insensible on a stranger's settle for 6 weeks instead. Lady Vane looked at the document. She looked at it with the expression of a person who has been building an argument on a particular foundation, and has discovered the foundation itself was not hers to stand on. She said, in a voice that was quieter and less certain than anything she had said since Stephen had walked through the door, that she had not been aware of that correspondence. Phelps said without editorial comment that the letter had been sent through the estate solicitor in January, upon Lord Ashford's direction, once he was well enough to write. Stephen looked at Edmund. He was looking at the document, not at her, but she thought she understood something about the 6 weeks now that she had not understood before. A thing that could not be named in a drawing room or an entrance hall, but that had been present in the cottage every night, in the careful turning of pages and the accurate arithmetic and the 6 weeks of plain, unglamorous attention. And she thought that the thing had been mutual, which made it different from most things she had experienced in her 23 years. Lady Vane said something else, more quietly, about the buyer from York and the arrangements she had made, which had been made in good faith. Edmund said the arrangements were her own, and Mr. Hartley could be written with an explanation. He said it without cruelty and without triumph. He said, after a pause, that the estate had been well maintained in his absence, and he trusted Mrs. Ridley had kept the household accounts in order, and he directed both remarks at Mrs. Ridley in the same breath, which meant he was dismissing and acknowledging in the same sentence, which was a more efficient form of address than most people managed in a full morning. Mrs. Ridley said, from the servant's stare, that the household accounts were in the estate office, and she would be glad to present them at Lord Ashford's convenience. Lady Vane's posture across the hall had changed. Not collapsed because she was not that sort of woman, but revised as though she had been reading from a particular score and had turned the page to find the piece in a different key than she expected. She looked once more at the documents on the hall table, then at Edmund, then at Stephen, and there was in her expression something that Stephen chose not to examine too closely, because it was not her place to examine it, and she had not come to the Grange to see anyone humiliated, only to say what needed saying, and the saying was being done on her behalf now by a man who had considerably more authority over the proceedings than she did. Phelps closed the document case with the quiet efficiency of a man whose work here was finished, said that he would be at the solicitor's office in the village should any further documentation be required, and collected his hat from the hall table where he had set it when he put down the documents. He addressed Edmund as Lord Ashford once more, quietly and precisely, in the manner of a man who uses titles because titles are the correct designation for the occasion, not because he is performing them, and left by the front door. The entrance hall was very quiet after he went. The cold of the flagged floor continued to come up through Stephen's boots. Mrs. Ridley remained at the top of the servants' stair in the same composed posture, witness to the entire thing, saying nothing, which was the most eloquent form of witness available. Lady Vane said, eventually, that she supposed she would write to Mr. Hartley herself. She said it in the tone of a person accepting the terms of an adjusted situation, which was the closest she was likely to come to an acknowledgement that the situation had been arranged on incorrect assumptions, and Stephen did not require her to come any closer than that. She turned and went back toward the corridor, and her footstep was measured and even, because she was not a woman who allowed her footstep to tell stories, and then she was gone. Edmund looked at Stephen across the entrance hall. The light through the front windows was the particular pale gold of an April morning, not warm yet but with the intention of warmth in it, and it fell across the stone floor and the hall table, and the portrait of the late Lord Ashford on the landing, with the same indifferent evenness. It fell across everything. He said he had intended to explain rather earlier. She said the timing had, as she understood it, been complicated by a fever. He said it had. She said after a moment that the drainage calculation she had brought with her was accurate to within 3 shillings, and that he could check her arithmetic if he wished. He said he was reasonably confident her arithmetic was correct. She said she was glad one of them had been confident about something. He took 1 step across the hall, and she did not take a step back, because she was not a person who retreated from things that had been present in her kitchen for 6 weeks, and were not, on reflection, frightening. He said her name again, not Miss Chambers, just the name she had told him on the 7th day by the fire, and said that he had spent 6 weeks in her cottage being nursed back to health by a woman who did not ask his name twice, who read aloud from agricultural texts without irony, and who had found the error in his drainage columns before he could recover sufficiently to explain himself, and that he had not, in all his years of managing the Ashford estate, encountered anyone he found more worth encountering. She looked at him for a long moment in the entrance hall of the house whose gate hung on one hinge, whose gravel wanted raking, whose chimneys had been producing economical smoke all winter for want of proper management. She said that the gate at the foot of the drive needed its latch replaced. He said with a gravity that was not quite straight that he had noticed. She said that the East Holdings drainage would require attention before the summer ploughing if the yield was to recover properly. He said he was aware. She said that 11 families on the Western Holdings had been waiting since October to know whether their situation was settled. He said that their situation was settled. He said it clearly and without reservation, in the tone of a man directing his own affairs, which was precisely what he was. She nodded once, in the way she acknowledged things that were now established and could be moved past, and then she said she supposed she should go back down the hill. He said with the smallest pause that he would walk down with her. The morning was cool but clear, the kind of April day that carried the promise of warmth inside the wind if you turned the right way. The gravel crunched under their feet in the way gravel crunched when it needed raking, irregular and slightly unpredictable, and the gate at the foot of the drive was still open on one hinge, and Edmund stopped at it briefly on the way through, examining the latch with the attention of a man making a mental note. And Stephen watched him do it, and thought about the accounts on the kitchen table, and the 6 weeks, and the particular way the room had felt different in the evenings. And she thought that she was not surprised by any of the morning's events, not deeply surprised, the way she had not been deeply surprised when the drainage column proved him correct, because certain things accumulate their evidence quietly over time and then arrive at a conclusion that feels less like revelation than like confirmation. They walked down the lane together, past the hawthorn hedge and the field gate, and the point where the cottage roof first came into view above the slope. and Edmund said, without looking at her, that the cottage required a new window latch on the pantry side, and that the chimney would want repointing before winter. She said she was aware, he said, still not looking at her, that Ashford Grange required someone who understood the eastern drainage system from the ground rather than from the account books, and that the position of estate manager had been vacant since his steward left for Cornwall in October. She did not say anything for a moment. She looked at the cottage roof over the slope, at the chimney that wanted repointing, at the gate into the yard where the hens were doing the deliberate, purposeful work of hens in the morning. She said that a person in that position would require a proper commission in writing. He said that Phelps would prepare one. She said she would look at it when it was ready. He stopped at the cottage gate and she stopped beside him, and the morning was very still in the way. Mornings are still when the wind pauses and the birds have not yet begun again, and the whole valley holds itself between one breath and the next. He looked at her with the same careful attention he had brought to everything in the cottage, the accounts and the books and the long evenings by the fire, and she looked back, and there was nothing in the look that needed naming, because the 6 weeks had already done all the naming that was required. She opened the cottage gate and stepped through it. The worn latch was smooth under her hand, familiar in the way things are familiar when you have touched them every day without noticing, until the day you understand, you almost lost them. She looked back once. He was still standing at the gate, hat in his hand, the pale April light on his face and the lane behind him, and the long gravel drive rising toward the Grange, where the chimneys were beginning to produce a slightly less economical smoke, because someone somewhere in that house had made a decision about the fires. She said she would expect the commission by Thursday. He said Thursday was entirely possible. She went inside. The kitchen was warm from the morning fire, the accounts still spread on the table from the previous evening, the pot-hook hanging empty over the grate, where the broth had been that winter, and the book she had been reading aloud from on the long nights when the fever was high, still sitting on the side table at the angle she had left it, because she had not been ready to move it somewhere else, and now she thought she would not move it at all. She stood at the kitchen table and looked at the accounts, and at the book, and at the room that had housed 6 weeks of something she could not have named then, and chose not to name now, because names were less important than the fact of the thing itself, which was that the cottage was hers, and the debt was nil, and the 11 families on the Western Holdings would be told today that their situation was settled, and Edmund Vane, Lord Ashford, was standing at her gate in the April morning, which was where he had apparently intended to be for longer than either of them had fully said. She sat down at the table and drew the accounts toward her because the ploughing still wanted planning, and the east drainage wanted a proper survey before summer, and there was a commission to review on Thursday, and the morning was beginning in earnest now, the kind of morning that required working through. The book stayed on the side table where she had left it. The latch on the cottage gate caught properly when it swung shut. Outside, on the lane, the sound of footsteps on the raked gravel, slow and unhurried, moved back up the hill toward the Grange.